Great. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Alberto Olivas. I'm director of the Congressman Ed Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service here at Arizona State University. And every election, I do these workshops, usually live, but I'm experimenting with doing a series of recorded videos to explain to voters all of the ballot measures that we're being asked to decide, in addition to electing people to a variety of offices at the national, state, and local levels. Arizona voters get to decide on many laws, 10 laws in the case of this year's election, which is a lot. And so this video today is just dealing with 3 out of the 10, and I'm doing the 3 at once because they all have to do with changes to how we conduct our citizens initiative process. So Arizona, like some states, most states don't do this, but several states, including Arizona, give voters the ability to pass laws directly. So in addition to our regular legislative process where we elect people to go to the state house and state senate and make laws, voters can also propose and vote on laws directly every 2 years on our ballot. And 3 of the propositions this year would like to make changes to that. And just where I'm coming from with this, I've been doing this for many years in different roles, but starting with and originally when I was the voter outreach director for Arizona, I worked for Secretary of State Betsy Bayless back in the lead up to the 2000 presidential election. And we did a whole lot of these workshops then. And ever since then, every 2 years, we use the ballot language. So what voters will actually see on their ballot. And we break that down so that it's easier to digest, because when voters get the official information, this booklet in the mail, it can be frankly overwhelming. And honestly, in my anecdotal experience, most people don't ever even open it and don't read it because they don't know what it is, much less how to navigate it. So that's the point of this workshop series, is to help break it down for voters so they can understand what it is that they're being asked to decide. So for starters, I like to always begin by explaining the numbering system, because it's not random and it's not even sequential in terms of when things qualify to make it onto the ballot. The numbers tell you something about what kind of a law is being proposed. So the 200s, if you see something that starts with the 2, that means that is a proposed law or a change to a law that came through the citizen initiative process. And so the citizens initiative, this bears explaining because these 3 ballot measures I'm going to be discussing all want to make changes to this process. Anyone in Arizona can propose a law that they would like to have passed. You don't have to be a lobbyist. You don't have to be an attorney or a politician. Anybody that's a registered voter can propose a law. And if you can get enough other registered voters to support you and sign your petition, it will be on the ballot. It'll be in this book, and it will be in front of every voter in that coming election. And so 200s are citizens initiatives, laws proposed by voters. And a lot of times where that's come from is when there may be a policy change or a law that enjoys the support of the majority or many people in our state, but that for whatever political reasons, the legislature is unable or unwilling to advance through the normal legislative process. So as an example, we recently in our state legalized recreational marijuana. And before that, we legalized medical marijuana. Both of those were made through the citizen initiative process because those were not laws that were able to survive our legislative process. And in fact, I'm not even sure if either of those laws were even ever submitted as bills for discussion by the legislature. So things like that, no politician, I think, wanted to champion marijuana, but voters wanted it. And so they were able to get enough signatures, they got it on the ballot, and they passed initiatives initially to legalize medical marijuana in Arizona, and then later on recreational marijuana. So those are examples of citizens initiatives. Those would be in the 200s. 300s means it's a proposed law that is being referred to voters by the legislature. So the legislature would have passed a bill to put something on the ballot before voters. So sometimes that comes because due to the nature of the policy or the law, the legislature decides that voters should have the final say on the issue. A lot of times it's because the legislature actually doesn't have the authority to pass certain kinds of laws and have to refer things to voters. As an example, the legislature in Arizona, unlike other states, they can't raise their own pay. So any proposal to increase legislator salary has to go to the voters. And you would see it in the 300s. We don't have that this year. And it's never passed, actually, since the mid-90s. voters have never approved a proposed increase to the salary for legislators. But if that was an issue this year, it would be in the 300s, referred by the legislature. Also, any proposed changes to the Constitution, our state Constitution, had to be referred to voters. So that brings me to the 100s. You might wonder, well, why did he start with the 200s and 300s and skip the 100s? The 100s are any proposed change to our state's Constitution. So that whether it's coming from a citizen initiative or referred by the legislature, if it deals with the constitutional change amendment, then it has to be in the 100s. And in this case, we have several in the 100s category, several proposed changes to our state's Constitution. I believe they were all referred by the legislature, but since they're not just regular laws, they're constitutional changes, you're going to see them in the 100s. And then depending on where you live in Arizona, you may or may not have things in the 400 category. Those would be local issues. So city, potentially county, school district questions would be listed in the 400s. Okay, so the ones we're going to be talking about today, there are 3 propositions. They're all proposed changes to the state constitution, and they all deal with changes to our citizens initiative process. So I mentioned how anyone that has any idea for a law or a change to a law, if you can write it up, file it with the Secretary of State's office, and then get enough registered voters to sign your petition, it will be on the ballot for all voters to decide. And so we have 3 proposed changes to that process, how things get qualified to be on the ballot through the initiative process, and what power, if any, the legislature has to make changes to those initiatives. So Prop 128 refers to the Voter Protection Act. And just to clarify, what that is, the Voter Protection Act was actually passed back in the 90s. So this is a change to the Voter Protection Act that's been in place now for almost 30 years. And to give you some context for that, back in the 90s, up until that point, it was often the case that citizens would go through a lot of effort to put an initiative on the ballot and get it passed. And after citizens approved a ballot measure through the initiative process, then the legislature would go in afterwards and make a lot of changes to it, or repeal the law entirely, or take away its funding. So for example, if there was an initiative to raise the sales tax to provide more money for schools, the legislature might go in afterwards and undo that funding mechanism. So that happened enough times in the 90s that voters got tired of having their initiatives changed, and they passed through the initiative process the Voter Protection Act, which says the legislature cannot make any changes to a law approved by voters through the initiative process unless it is to further the intent of the voters. But otherwise, they can't repeal, undo, defund, any of those things. The legislature basically has to leave it alone, and any changes that they would make would have to further the intent of the voters and has to be approved through a supermajority vote in both houses of the state legislature. So very, very difficult to make changes. Ever since then, the legislature has made different attempts to create more opportunities and give themselves more power to make changes, they would say corrections to things that need to be fixed in laws approved by voters. So let's look at the first of these, Prop 128. You would vote yes on 128 if you think it's a good idea to change the state constitution to give the legislature power to make changes, amend, divert funds from, move monies, or supersede entirely an initiative that was approved by voters or a referendum under certain circumstances. So as long as the Arizona or the US Supreme Court found that all or part of that citizens initiative that had been voted in by voters was unconstitutional in some way. So a no vote means you don't think that's a good idea. You want to keep our current laws, which don't allow the legislature to supersede, defund, or otherwise change an initiative in a way that doesn't further the will of the voters. A yes vote, again, means you do want to give the legislature the ability to make those changes or corrections so long as either the state or the US Supreme Court have found that all or part of that initiative is unconstitutional. So that's the first of the proposed changes to our citizens initiative. That's Prop 128. You would vote yes if you do want to give the legislature that additional power to make changes to citizens' initiatives. And you would vote no if you don't think that's a good idea and you want to keep things the way they are, which is very limiting in the legislature's ability to make any changes to approved citizens' initiatives. There are a lot of supporters for these three changes that I'm going to be talking about, and you'll see a lot of the same names over and over. So what I'm listing here are individuals and organizations that wrote arguments in favor of Prop 128. And as I said, you'll see arguments in this booklet. Every section in this booklet for each ballot measure has arguments that were sent in either in favor or against each ballot measure. And so for 128, these are some of the supporting organizations, and you'll see that there are many of the same ones supported Props 129 and 132 as well. So a lot of business and tax concerned organizations, conservative or Republican policy organizations here. And then opponents include a lot of organizations that do, some of these are seen as more progressive or liberal or do more grassroots work on citizens initiatives and don't think it's a good idea to have the legislature, give the legislature more ability to make changes to initiatives approved by voters. And here are some additional organizations that wrote arguments against 128. And bottom right corner, you can see the actual page numbers where you can read the arguments. I always say it's a good idea for voters to just kind of skim those arguments, but at least look at who wrote the arguments, because sometimes that can give you enough information to decide how you want to vote. All right, the second proposed change to our initiative process is Prop 129. So this deals, it's called the Citizens Initiative Single Subject Act. And so a yes vote means you want to change our state's constitution that in a way that would require that any citizens initiative that is proposed can only address a single change to the law, a single subject, and that change has to be clearly expressed in the title of the initiative measure. So I couldn't propose a citizens initiative, for example, and call it the Free Puppies for Orphans initiative. And then in addition to providing free puppies for orphans, I'm also going to increase a tax to provide a subsidy for purchasers of luxury vehicles. So that wouldn't fly if 129 passes because it's more than one subject. And if the title of my citizens initiative was Puppies for Orphans, the fact that the vehicle subsidy isn't mentioned in the title would mean it doesn't comply with these requirements. So 129 says we want to change the Constitution to make sure that only that citizens initiatives in the future can only deal with one change to the law, and that the nature of that change has to be clearly expressed in the title of the initiative. Currently, that requirement, some people might say, well, isn't that already the law? That requirement currently only pertains to proposed changes to our state constitution, not regular laws. So initiatives that only make changes to laws or propose new laws that are not changes to the state constitution are not limited to just deal with a single subject. And there's nothing in there about whether all of the content of the initiative has to be described in the title of the initiative. No vote means you don't think it's a good idea to add these new requirements to the citizens initiative process. You want to keep things the way they are now. So again, you'll see a lot of the same names here supporting wrote arguments in favor of Prop 129, generally business-focused organizations, conservative and Republican policy organizations. And a lot of the same arguments against Prop 129. Some of these more progressive or liberal organizations or organizations that do a lot of community organizing. And the arguments here are basically saying this would be limiting the power of citizens to pass laws directly through the initiative process. Some of what they refer to in the arguments are the relatively recent Save Our Schools initiative that created through the initiative process. an increase to a sales tax to provide more funds for public schools. And so they're saying the reason for this initiative is that the legislature wants to be able to undo the funding schema for initiatives like this that pass through the initiative process and not through the legislature. And then finally, the third of the three proposed changes to the initiative process is Prop 132. So it's worth noting this is not in sequence. I'm skipping two of the propositions just so I can deal with all three that make changes to the initiative process together. And I'll be addressing the other initiatives and referendum separately. But Prop 132 deals with a supermajority vote requirement for ballot measures. So 132 would require that at least 60% of votes cast, a supermajority of votes, have to be cast in order to approve a citizens initiative or legislative referendum that would increase or enact a new tax. So this is saying currently the law only requires a majority. So 50% of the votes plus one vote is enough to pass an initiative, whether or not it has anything to do with raising or creating a tax. So 132 says we don't think a majority is enough. If we're going to create or increase a tax, then we need then it should be approved by at least 60% of votes cast, not just a simple majority. So it's raising the bar for what it takes to pass an initiative that would enact a new tax. And that would be a change to our state's constitution. And it would preserve existing law on, a no vote means you don't think we need a super majority vote in order to pass increases or new taxes. We want to keep our current law, which only requires a majority plus one of votes cast. So supporters, again, you'll see some of the same organizations, conservative organizations, business organizations. Governor Ducey is on the record as supporting 132 and so forth, as well as these tax and conservative fiscal policy organizations. And opponents include a lot of the organizations you saw going on the record opposed to the other propositions, 128 and 129, League of Women Voters, Center for Economic Progress, Arizona Education Association, and so forth. So I do encourage voters to take a look at the arguments for and against and make up your own mind. They're generally pretty brief, and just on the arguments process, anyone can write arguments for and against any of these ballot propositions and have them printed and mailed to every household with registered voters across the whole state. This is also available online on the Arizona Secretary of State's website. So if you didn't get this in the mail, you can just Google Arizona Secretary of State, and on her homepage, Secretary Hopp's homepage, if you scroll down, you'll see the publicity pamphlet is linked, and you can view it in English and in Spanish in its entirety. And it is indexed, so you can skip right to the propositions that you want to look at. So these are the organizations that are against Prop 132. So there are more on the record against Prop 132 than the others. And so each of these are individuals or organizations that wrote arguments saying, please vote no on 132. And you'll see in the bottom right, as I mentioned, the page numbers where you can view those arguments. These are additional organizations that wrote arguments saying vote no on 132. And that's the last of the opponents to 132. So those are the three proposed constitutional amendments that seek to make changes to our citizens initiative process. 128, 129, and 132. That's the kind of quick and short version of it. 128 wants to give the legislature the ability to make changes or supersede, completely undo initiatives if they're found to be unconstitutional. 129 wants to limit citizens initiatives to make only a single change to the law, the single subject rule, and that change has to be clearly described in the title of the initiative. And Prop 132 wants to require a supermajority, 60% of votes cast, in order to pass into law an initiative that would increase or create a new tax. Currently, the law only requires a majority vote. So that's those three initiatives. I'll be dealing with the others later, but does anyone have any questions or comments about any of the three at this time? Okay, well, thanks. I hope that was helpful for you, and I hope that gives you a little bit more confidence in your ability to use this guide, either the print version or online, to answer your own questions. The first thing you'll see in each ballot section is all the technical language, which frankly, for me, is the least helpful section on each of the ballot initiatives. After you have all the technical stuff, then you'll see a summary, a legislative analysis by legislative council. That is a bipartisan staff organization. They support the legislature and they do research on each of these initiatives to determine what they really mean, what the impact would be. So it's often the most easily understood description of what each one entails. And then the last section that you'll see is the actual ballot language. A yes vote means this, a no vote means that. So I usually start with the yes vote, no vote language, then I look at the legislative council analysis, and then I just skim like who wrote the arguments for and against. Honestly, sometimes I don't even read the arguments. It's enough for me to just look at who wrote the arguments to be able to make up my mind. But I hope you will all use this information to make informed votes. And just the parting note is, we know from the research that one of the main factors that affects whether or not people vote is how much they understand about what's on the ballot, and do they understand how things will affect them personally. So if you care, if you're like me and you want to try and get as many people voting in our state as possible, then I would say pick one or two issues that really matter a lot to you, and use your influence, use your social media presence, use your interaction in meetings and the organizations you're involved with to make sure that people that you know understand what's at stake in this election on at least one issue. People may feel very discouraged and hopeless about, for example, the governor's race or the Secretary of State's race outcomes. And you can tell them, well, maybe we can't do anything about that, but there are these other things that are also really important that are going to affect our lives and our political realities in Arizona beyond just who gets elected to those offices. We have these laws, and this one in particular matters a lot to me. So don't underestimate your ability to change people's behavior just by letting them know what's at stake in the election, and focus on just one or two ballot initiatives or propositions that matter a lot to you. So thanks very much for joining me. Feel free to share this recording link with anyone you think could benefit from it. And if you have any questions, drop me a line at alberto.olivas, O-L-I-V-A-S, @asu.edu. Thanks very much.